Releasing originally as an Xbox exclusive, it only took a matter of months for Escape from Butcher Bay to make its way to the PC. But while the Xbox version was one of the best-selling games on the platform, the PC version fell well short of sales expectations. Depending on who you ask, you will get different reasons why this was the case. However, after personally playing through both versions of the game, I've got some thoughts of my own. Welcome, my name's Azadash, and welcome to another PC game retrospective video. As I've mentioned before, video games based on films, especially those released around the millennium, had a fairly good chance of being a cheap cash-in with limited gameplay value and questionable presentation. However, in the case of Riddick's adventure to Butcher Bay, that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, I'd go as far to say that Riddick not only avoided the tropes of other film-licensed games, but as a standalone property, improved and innovated in the areas of stealth and combat, while delivering a very ambitious overall presentation, particularly in the area of lighting and shadows. Now, I said the game originally released for Xbox, and this was the first version of the game I played some 20 years ago. I always had concerns about first-person shooters using a controller, as I found I had a lot more precision using a keyboard and mouse. However, I quickly found that the gameplay loop of Riddick is quite welcoming to a controller. Firstly, projectile combat for the most part is a lot slower paced, and combined with a fairly generous auto-aim, never really gave me any issues. Whereas the close combat arguably performed better with a controller, given the greater sensitivity when landing blows from the left or right while maintaining momentum, something which is essential in some of the harder fights. However, for this video, I am replaying the 2004 PC version of Escape from Butcher Bay, which was subtitled The Developer's Cut. Now, this version is not to be confused with the 2009 remake, which was included in the game's official sequel, Assault on Dark Athena, which features a completely revamped presentation and is the subject for another video. As it stands, the original PC version is very similar to the Xbox release. However, it has several tweaks, such as some missions having slightly different objectives, as well as some new areas to explore. Overall presentation also gets a bump, with the greater power available on PC used to improve the overall fidelity. For this playthrough, I'm not playing with any modifications or patches, and for the most part, I found this original version still works fairly well on modern hardware. The one caveat is that while the game renders the environment in an aspect ratio appropriate scale in widescreen, the HUD is stretched. However, given the HUD is so minimal and actually hidden the majority of the time, I never really noticed it, and it certainly didn't impact my gaming experience. Critical reception of both the Xbox and PC version was very good upon release, and currently holds an 89 and 90 Metacritic score respectively. Broadly speaking, I agree with these ratings, although I will say that issues like graphical glitches certainly didn't have the impact on reviews like they do today. Alas, if I am comparing with what was the accepted norm for scoring at the time, I do agree with these ratings. Riddick's adventure in Butcher Bay serves as a prequel to the first movie in the franchise, Pitch Black. The fact that this is a prequel as opposed to a direct tie-in to the movie gave the developers a lot more creative license on how to best use the character, and for the most part, despite needing a healthy dose of suspension of belief at times, delivers an entertaining main storyline complete with several smaller story arcs. The main story sees Riddick delivered to the infamous prison by a bounty hunter named Johns, who is seeking a handsome reward for capturing him. Upon taking control of the player, you need to survive the prison's many dangers, such as other prisoners, the guards, and some things that are more dangerous than both of them, in a quest to explore the prison and ultimately find a way to escape. While the main story beat of Escape the Prison seems quite one-dimensional, the game features a lot more storytelling and narration by interacting with other characters and completing side quests. These quests range from things like taking out a rival gang member to helping someone find their glasses and everything in between. Perhaps my only criticism of the story and overall narrative is, despite it including a lot of dialogue and interaction with NPCs, I never really felt a meaningful connection with the protagonist or any of the NPCs. I was completing quests to tick them off the list, as opposed to genuinely wanting to see how the interactions played out. Now, I'm not saying that there was no enjoyment in ticking these off a list, but it certainly didn't evoke any type of emotion when doing so, even in some of the more morally questionable quests. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's shoot out some lights, enable eyeshine, and head back to 2004 to remember the Chronicles of Riddick: Escape from Butcher Bay. The best way to describe Riddick's gameplay is a first and sometimes third-person stealth shooter with some RPG elements. Now, credit to the developers, there are a lot of actual gameplay mechanics within the game. Most of the time when games try and deliver something so varied, they often struggle to do any of them well. But honestly, in the case of Riddick, for the most part, all of the mechanics are quite solid and feel appropriately balanced, for better or worse. More on this shortly. One of the things that set the game apart from other first-person shooters at the time was a very minimal HUD, so minimal that for the majority of the adventure, there is no HUD, with only info about health and weapons popping up when needed. This really gives the game a cinematic feel and allows you to really take in everything in the environment without distraction, which at times is required to understand how to progress. While the game is predominantly played from a first-person perspective, certain actions see the camera switch to a third-person perspective, affording the player a little more awareness of their surroundings during these segments. It's not an overused mechanic, and while I originally thought it would be a bit jarring going back and forth, it actually works pretty well. The only issue is that if you're using Riddick's eyeshine ability, when the camera transitions to third person, it removes the eyeshine lens, making seeing where you're going a little more difficult. Although truth be told, it's rare for this to actually manifest itself as any real issue. The game's combat is divided into three types: close combat, stealth, and assault. Close combat is used predominantly with the other inmates and ranges from using Riddick's bare fists to finding items like screwdrivers and scalpels to buying items like a shiv or a club using the in-game currency which can be found throughout the prison. Word of warning though, if you are carrying a weapon and approach too close to a guard in selected areas, they will search you and remove the item. This is somewhat of a risk versus reward mechanic, as using these weapons in fights with other inmates can dramatically turn the odds in your favour as opposed to just fists. The actual first-person combat was good for the time, however it has not really aged well by modern standards, with it lacking any real depth apart from closing in and backing off while swinging your fists or weapon. Alas, it is certainly still serviceable for the most part. Stealth is often a choice and generally a very good one, with the player being able to use a variety of close combat takedowns or use a tranquilizer gun to stun an enemy and then run up to them and finish them. This requires some planning though, as the tranquilizer only holds one round before it requires to be reloaded, meaning that missing your target, particularly if an enemy is already alerted to you, can result in you taking a lot of damage. This was probably my favourite playstyle and can be used in combination with shooting out lights and using Riddick's eyeshine ability to see enemies before they can see you. Although another risk versus reward mechanic is here in the fact that if an enemy guard uses a flashlight, they will both spot and blind Riddick, often resulting in taking damage. The last combat type is assault, and this is just what it sounds like: projectile weapons and lots of enemies. For me, this is the weakest combat type in the game, and honestly, I'd argue the game would have been better without it. Granted, it's probably the least used combat mechanic in the game, but it just doesn't really support other elements of the game design, like the slower, more deliberate movement speed and the minimalist HUD. The actual weapons themselves don't feel great and have some of the highest recoil I have ever witnessed in a shooter. Honestly, the recoil on practically every weapon makes hitting any target, let alone a mobile enemy, a chore at times. I get the idea this was done from a balancing perspective to not make Riddick feel too powerful, but yeah, it just doesn't really fit with the rest of the game. Outside of combat, there's a fair bit of exploration and some light puzzle solving as you navigate both the main and side quest lines. While the progression in the game is quite linear, it never really feels linear thanks to the various side quests which pop up very frequently throughout the adventure. The only criticism I have around the progression is that at times the game will overshare objective information to ensure you know exactly what to do and where. Now, I need to be careful here because I've just come off reviewing a game that's objectives were vague to the point of sometimes not even knowing what you need to do, but but I feel that in the case of Riddick, the developers could have backed the environments in a little more, which are all excellent, to help guide the player as to how to progress. I don't know if this came about after playtesting or something, but the game even includes not so subtle world details like labelling the insides of some vents as to their destination to really cue the player into where to progress. While this does speed things along, it does remove some of the challenge, and I think there might have been a middle ground by disabling some of these things for a more challenging experience. Regardless of the signposting in the levels, the actual level design is very good, and no matter which area of the prison you're navigating, everything feels appropriately thematic, with the levels for the most part leaning into the stealth experience and allowing you to use and enjoy this playstyle. There is a notable exception to this about a third of the way through the game, and it's worth mentioning this from a pacing perspective also. There's a section which sees Riddick without any projectile weapons and an enemy AI that will virtually always spot you regardless of how you approach the area, which will cause a swarm of guards requiring Riddick to run through the area trying to avoid being shot. I died several times in this area. In fact, I think I died more in this area than the rest of the game combined. Thankfully, this area isn't overly large, but it does put a dent in the game's otherwise excellent pacing. Outside of the pacing issue, I don't have a lot of negative things to say about the game. The game does have some clipping issues, particularly in close combat, as well as some anomalies like Riddick having a conversation with a wall at one stage. But honestly, while these things impact the presentation, they don't really impact the gameplay. In terms of the actual presentation, it's solid, but it's very obviously a port of an Xbox game. Firstly, the load screens are quite frequent. During the completion of perhaps a 5-minute side quest, you can see as many as 3 loading screens as the game loads new sections of the map in. I will say that they are logically placed, often in an airlock or hallway of connecting doors, but I suspect this is a carryover from the Xbox's memory limitations. Even the main menu screen, where you would expect a PC game to show a load game option, Riddick shows a checkpoint option, which you can then enter to load your last checkpoint, or thankfully a quick save. None of these things are overly intrusive, but I do think a little more polish could have been applied to better align with the PC audience. Graphically, the game looks great, and even by PC standards of this era, still stands tall among its competition. The only area I think might be contentious is the way in which shadows and lighting are used, and look, let's be real here, this was 2004. Things like global illumination and ray tracing were a long way away. If you look at this with a view that they are used stylistically as opposed to realistically, then they make a lot of sense and look great. But at times, they can occasionally look out of place, especially within cutscenes. But all in all, the base game still looks great, even without the updated graphics of the 2009 remake, something that certainly can't be said about every game from the early 2000s. Sound design mirrors that of the HUD, minimalist, with the game's soundtrack featuring mostly ambient beats. This suits the game perfectly and really lets the excellent sound effects and voice acting take center stage.
Yeah, well, as of this moment, Butcher Bay owns your ass. I own your ass.
He's all yours once I sign him over, Hoxie.
You're not gonna be a problem, are you, Riddick? 'Cause my boys and I like solving problems.
There's a star-studded cast of voice actors here, including Ron Perlman, Exhibit, and of course Vin Diesel, with all actors nailing their brief and fitting right into the game world. Now, after listening to me heap praise on Riddick, you're probably wondering why it sold so poorly on PC, especially after the Xbox version quickly became a bestseller. There's various official accounts online as to the reason, with things like consumers being concerned about the film-to-game adaptation or lack of marketing by the publisher, but I think it's a lot less about Riddick and more about what else was released around it. The actual release was just weeks after the release of Half-Life 2, and as someone who lived through this period, I can tell you that no matter what you read or wherever you went, it was Half-Life 2 front and center for PC gamers. While I obviously don't know the reasons for the original Xbox exclusivity, I can't help but think that the PC version would have done much better if it released alongside the Xbox version in June, a month that for PC was fairly devoid of any AAA shooters, with Far Cry releasing in March and Doom 3 not releasing until August. Regardless of the original sales figures though, the game is still very playable in modern times, and while gamers' tolerance levels for things like clipping and graphical glitches have reduced over the years and may be more harshly judged today, Riddick still manages to deliver a robust performance from start to finish. If you haven't played this game, I would encourage you to seek it out. It's one of the best of its kind and something we don't get an awful lot of in modern times. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.